Hello, you're watching TVP World Talks. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. The Trump administration and some members of NATO are at loggerheads once more, this time over Washington's request to provide aid in the Hormuz Strait crisis. As countries like Spain and France close their airspace to US military operations, and as Trump himself questions the future of NATO as we know it, it's time to ask the question: are we at the brink of a major shift in global security? Joining us here today is Roland Freudenstein, co-founder of Brussels Freedom Hub. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So we seem to have entered a period of mutual distrust. Do you think there is a way out of it? Or are we destined to see the most powerful alliance on Earth fracturing?
Well, Europe is definitely going through another Greenland moment. What I mean is that the Greenland crisis, the US threats to actually take Greenland in January made for an exceptional shift in transatlantic relations and a especially intense loss of trust of the Europeans in the US. And this time, it is Trump who has painted himself into a corner in Iran, and he's lashing out at his European allies. That's the feeling we have. And the result is the same as in the Greenland case. There is a renewed drive for European unity vis-a-vis this US administration that is threatening, bullying, and insulting us. And there is much more of a political push to develop capabilities to make us less dependent on the United States, both in regards to the Ukraine war, Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, and European security in general. So these are the two things that are happening now. There's a renewed will to unify, and there is another push for European independence in security affairs.
Well, if you're saying it's a Greenland moment, it could actually sound optimistic, because, I mean, the whole affair petered out. There was no invasion, there was no confrontation there. There is a promise of further negotiations. It seems like the issue has largely disappeared from the agenda, at least for now. Do you think that NATO will emerge out of that, if not unscathed, then at least, well, fundamentally intact, despite all these reservations that the Europeans now have?
I think NATO has been slowly degraded over more than a year now, because every statement of Donald Trump where he belittles the efforts of allies to help the United States when they're attacked, where he predicts that the US is not going to come to Europe's aid if they're attacked by Russia, his complaints that if allies don't help the US in the war that the US caused, US will not come to the rescue, withdraw from Europe, and so on. I mean, all this is ending up in the Europeans relying more on themselves. And of course, that's a difficult process. And we're too slow in this, that's for sure. And yes, the energy crisis and the looming global economic crisis, because of the situation in the Middle East, and especially the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, is making things worse. That is for sure. But I would say in the end, Europeans need to create structures in which they can guarantee their own security with or without the United States, but not dependent on the US to the extent that we have been dependent until now.
Now, let's look at the situation from the other perspective, because some commentators are looking at countries like Spain, like France and Italy and saying, well, okay, but if you want all members of NATO to act in a spirit of solidarity, to uphold the idea of the alliance, then isn't closing the airspace going a bit too far? And wasn't this bound to infuriate Trump and reinforce the doubts that he already had regarding NATO?
Well, let's put it this way. I think Trump was looking for an opportunity to say, I was right when I insulted the Allies in January over Afghanistan, being cowardish and so on in Afghanistan. So, closing the airspace was not the only element of Trump's criticism. In fact, the most important point was Europe's refusal to go into the Strait of Hormuz and secure it against Iranian attacks of commercial shipping, and while the war is going on. So,
do you think Europe was right to flat out refuse?
At the moment, yes. I mean, look, there are not the necessary capabilities to do a job that even the US themselves can't do. The US Navy is not capable of securing the Strait of Hormuz at this point. So how could a bunch of smaller navies, which much fewer available ships, secure the Strait of Hormuz when the US can't do this? The Europeans have been saying for a couple of weeks already that they're absolutely willing to secure the strait after a ceasefire. And I think that's the correct position because that corresponds to the abilities of the Europeans. But the US is not indicating exactly when the ceasefire will be. In fact, Trump is zigzagging between a peace deal with the mullahs without opening the Strait of Hormuz to the next moment, the next day, saying that he wants to escalate the war and bomb them into the Stone Age where they belong, to quote Donald Trump. So, as long as these signals from the US are so contradictory, I don't think the Europeans can do anything else than stick to their line and say, we're not going in there now. You broke it, you own it. And we are going to help secure the Strait of Hormuz after some kind of ceasefire is achieved.
Do you think there is a risk of the US feeling vindicated, in one regard? Because the US keeps saying Ukraine is not our war, let Europe pay for it. Europe has been outraged by this because we obviously say, well, this is actually about collective security. So now the US is asking for help in Iran. Europe says it's not our war, and it kind of looks as if he's putting a mirror up to Europe and asking, do you like what you see? Do you think that there is a risk that we're kind of losing one important argument that we have rightly been advancing vis-a-vis the Trump administration on Ukraine?
Well, that's the way certainly Trump and a couple of people around him see it. But that's not the way, that's not the reality that we have on the ground. Let me start with saying that in Ukraine's case, Russia attacked Ukraine, right? It was a war of choice of Russia. In Iran's case, it was Israel and the United States that attacked Iran at a time when negotiations were still ongoing. And this whole, let me say this, it's really important to say. When Trump complains that the allies don't help the US in a difficult military situation and that NATO allies should help the US, he's absolutely wrong. I think he's too stupid to understand or unwilling to understand what NATO is for. NATO is a defensive alliance. NATO is for when one member gets attacked by another country, then the other members will do what they can to help that country. That's Article 5 of NATO. Now, as far as paying for Ukraine, and this is the second point here, the Europeans are already paying over 99% of the cost of helping Ukraine. The US is hardly paying a penny anymore. We are even at a point where, because of the war that the US caused in Iran, in the Middle East, weapons that are destined for Ukraine, US weapons paid by European money, destined for Ukraine, are either held back to fill up the US stockpiles or are directly diverted to the Middle East where they're used, for example, air defense systems and so on, and ammunition, where they're used for America's war against Iran.
Well, that's a very important point, actually. Do you think that Europe has any remedies against this? I mean, wouldn't this technically be a breach of contract? Because the weapons are not going to fulfill their intended purpose. Instead, they are being, as you're saying, they might be held up or redirected completely.
Well, the US government until now officially maintains that all weapons transports are still on track. But they have also indicated that if push comes to shove, if necessary, well, yes, they will cancel contracts and they will say, we need these weapons ourselves. It's America first, and every other country would act the same way. This is the arguments we hear from Washington. So far, it hasn't happened yet, but it may happen anytime. And in that case, I mean, of course, the Europeans need to create a situation in which we are less reliant on US weapons deliveries anyway, or even European weapons deliveries, by enabling Ukraine to produce their own weapons. And they're doing it beautifully already with drones and a couple of types of other weapon systems, autonomous weapon systems and so on. And we need to broaden that and give Ukraine the financial assistance, economic help to actually produce more weapons themselves.
So one final question, where does that leave countries like Poland, which have been staunch allies to the United States? Retired General Keith Kellogg, former US negotiator in Ukraine, actually suggested maybe we might need a new alliance with countries like Poland, Germany, but also he mentioned Ukraine there. Do you think that this might also be a part of the strategy outlined in one of the official Washington documents, namely trying to drive a wedge into the European Union and shift, the focus on a number of countries which the US sees as more loyal allies, essentially?
Well, frankly speaking, I don't know what he was smoking when he made that statement, because there isn't the slightest prospect of any new alliance structure emerging with the United States, Ukraine, and a couple of selected European countries. I honestly think that this is not on the cards. The Europeans need to band together more strongly, and we need to create our own military capabilities. And that is the way forward. And that includes Poland, and it increasingly includes Ukraine, which becomes a security provider, even while it is defending itself against Russian aggression.
But some weapons are not available. I mean, Europe doesn't make some of the weapon types that are necessary in this regard. So still, the US is like the only source.
Yeah. That is definitely true, but that's not a basis for a military alliance or some kind of new structure to be created. Yes, we of course need to get as much security, and that includes defense technology, as we can from the United States while we can. But at the same time, we need to be much more active in creating our own structures. And this will not only be inside the European Union, this will have to include countries like Britain and Norway and others. And it definitely will be in coalitions of the willing, as the saying goes. But these are going to be European coalitions of the willing.
Roland Freudenstein was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And I'm Jonasz Rewiński. You're watching TVP World. Please do stay with us.